Well, thank you once again for joining us on Near and Rupar, our weekly live stream. I'm David Near, publisher of The Down Ballot. My co-host is Aaron Rupar, publisher of Public Notice. And every Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central, that's Aaron's time zone, we go live to discuss the most important stories making news around the country, from the top of the ballot all the way on down. And last week, we finished off by discussing the No Kings rallies, which, because of the era we're living in, it already feels like those were a long time ago. But I'm trying my hardest to hold on to those feelings that I experienced because I had an unbelievable time. I was able to get one of those inflatable frog costumes, Aaron, and I totally shocked my girlfriend. She had no idea. And when we went down to Times Square here in New York City, it was incredible. The crowds were massive, and everyone wanted a picture of the frog. They wanted a picture with me. They wanted a picture of me. My girlfriend Kylie was like the patient photographer, taking pictures for like all ages, from like little kids to old folks. And the range of ages, the diversity of the crowd was absolutely incredible. And I just felt so energized by it. And I would love to hear from folks in the comments. What was your experience? Did you go? Where did you go? What was it like? How big was the crowd? Did you dress up in an inflatable costume too? Did you see any other frogs? Let us know all about it, because I think it's so important to remember that strength in numbers is everything. And seeing that there are millions, around 7 million fellow Americans who felt strongly enough that they also wanted to show up in every corner of the country, and also tons of people abroad as well, to express their support for this movement and to oppose tyranny. That was just amazing to me.
Yeah, now I'm wondering if I maybe saw you in some of the Getty images from New York because for a couple newsletter items, I was scrolling through a lot of the pictures. I ended up actually using one from Minneapolis of some people who were in dinosaur costumes. But yeah, a lot of people had the costume motif going on, and I'd have to go back and revisit the New York ones to see if there are any frogs in those photos. And if I do see one, I'll shoot along to you to see if maybe that's you in one of these pictures. But
It was pretty nuts. Gothamist did a piece on it, and I'm like scrolling through. I'm like, oh crap, that's me. And I knew it
wow.
was me and not another frog, because I was carrying a sign, "Frogs Together Strong." And so it was
Wow.
unquestionably me. You could see like my girlfriend in the off in the corner. So yeah, I showed up in all kinds of social media feeds randomly. It was nuts.
Amazing. And has there been any estimate of whether was New York the single largest one? Did anybody bother to figure that out? Or
That's a good question. I believe so. G. Elliott Morris,
Mhm.
whose Substack is called Strength in Numbers,
Yeah.
appropriately enough. He focuses on polling and data. He spearheaded a crowdsourced effort to try to count crowds at all of these events, more than 2,500, I believe. And I'm pretty sure New York was tops. But to me, Aaron, the amazing thing is seeing these smaller rallies in super red areas, small towns, rural regions. I mean, it's not just an urban thing.
Yeah, I actually dropped by the one up in Forest Lake, Minnesota, which is my hometown and has been mostly in the news lately because it's also the hometown of Pete Hegseth. And I know his
Oh,
family a little
right.
bit. He's a few years older than I am, but we went to the same high school. And even there, which is like a 65% red, I think Trump won about 65% up there in last year. There were at least a couple hundred people there gathered and along the highway, honking horns, and they've actually had kind of spontaneous rallies like that every Saturday now, going back even to last winter. So, even a town like that, where if you're a liberal in Forest Lake, you feel kind of isolated from your brethren, your ideological brethren. But even there, there were a couple hundred people, including my mom, and my mom's a retired teacher, so a lot of colleagues of hers and other retired teachers, were gathered kind of right on the roadway there, and I think she said she was there for longer than I was, but she said there were only a couple cars that drove by, flicking them off. There were more honks of support than middle fingers, but like I said, that town is a very Trumpy town, and so just the fact that that many people turned out, I thought was a good sign because the previous little Saturday rallies that they've had have been usually like a couple dozen people, but in this case it was kind of a mass gathering, and that was really cool to see.
Yeah, I saw literally all of two Trump counter protesters. And the guidance from the organizers of the No Kings rallies just said, don't interact. And as I saw them, I walked by and I'm like, man, why would I? That would just be this so beneath me. I'm here to experience this joy with all these people. It
Yeah,
was like you're carrying your Trump banner on the side of, 7th Avenue. It's like,
yeah.
okay,
And when you,
totally
yeah,
relevant today.
and when you consider, I think the most solid estimate that I've seen, I do think this comes from GLA Morris, but was 6 million. It seemed to be was kind of the number that was settled upon as like, probably the most realistic. But, when you consider that many people out demonstrating and there wasn't one incident of violence, I think maybe there were a
Right?
couple arrests, but nothing that really rose to the level of anything that the Trumpist forces could seize upon as being, sort of like something to incite, a crackdown or something of that sort. I mean, it really is amazing because I was concerned going in, about Trump trying to create a pretext for a further crackdown or to really inflame tensions. And, all throughout the day, I was kind of checking my phone nervously to, in hopes that something like that would not happen. And it turned out that it didn't happen. And so, in that case, in that respect, it really was a best case scenario that the turnout was so huge that it was peaceful and that, people who partook pretty much universally, I haven't heard anyone say that they had anything other than a really positive experience, that it was really kind of galvanizing. And so, just a really great day all around.
Of course, Republicans are super fucking pissed about all this. They're pissed that it didn't turn violent because that's a huge disappointment to them. They wanted to be able to discredit the movement, the pro democracy, no kings movement, and they got nothing. They got bupkis. And yet, I saw a poll that said 1 in 8 Republicans think that the protests were mostly violent.
Hmm.
So you're dealing with and a large number also said they weren't sure about whether there was violence. And so,
Hmm.
you're dealing with a political backdrop where Republicans are so deep into their bubble that they'll just assume that whatever their politicians tell them is true, and anything they'll also assume the absolute worst of their political opponents. So that's a scary place to be in. And then there's Trump's reaction. I have no doubt in my mind that Trump saw all this and got incredibly pissed. And I mean, it's just so embarrassing. He was saying, in an interview just before No Kings, why are they calling me a king? I'm not a king. And then they go and
Uh,
release that fucking disgusting video of him literally wearing a crown and dumping shit on New York
yeah.
City. I mean, like a lot of the media didn't even want to tackle that. And like, can you imagine if Obama, Biden, et cetera? I don't even need to finish the sentence. But I feel that it really extended into this week because in my mind, Trump said, "You tell me I'm not a king. I'll prove to you I am a king. I'm going to tear down the fucking White House." And
Yeah.
I'm just I don't have words to describe my feelings about that.
Yeah, I want to go back just a bit to what you mentioned about the polling, with 1 in 8 Republicans who said that they were largely violent or there was violence. Because that actually, that kind of makes sense now to me as I've watched this week, Mike Johnson holding his daily shutdown news conferences. And, it's very notable to me because he still brings it up almost every day. This idea of, I thought that once the Democrats got done with their Hate America rally, the pro Hamas wing, that then they would vote to reopen the government. And, Tom Emmer had some comments that I clipped, along similar lines this week where, it's so exceedingly dishonest because everybody knows who's been paying attention that is not, that it wasn't like a terrorist rally or anything like that. But, I do that. Kind of, it's sort of a little bit of a chicken and egg thing in that respect where I wonder if, because Republicans are listening to these guys and maybe they're, believing that they're credible sources of information, or, if that's kind of like a base management exercise that they can't really, admit that they were wrong or that they
Oh
mischaracterized
yeah.
thing. And, you would hope that maybe, if you get caught in a spot like that, you would just, maybe change the topic, move on instead of continuing to lie about something like that. But, I guess that makes a little bit more sense if, that they want the base to continue to believe a certain thing. Maybe they feel like they have to reinforce that on a daily basis by lying. Because, my expectation, and, I'm pretty cynical about Republicans, was that once the rally came and went, that they would just sort of drop it. But, they really haven't. And then, of course, you brought up Trump. Trump, along similar lines, when he has directly talked about no kings this week, has just completely lied about it. He had a comment yesterday about how the crowds were so small, don't believe what the media reported. They were actually, very small crowds. And, which is obviously just, egregious lying. But yeah, the visuals that you mentioned of the White House being torn down, I think shocked a lot of people this week. And, for people who have spent time near the White House, the East Wing is not the most famous of the wings. I mean, the West Wing is obviously the one that you hear about the most, and there's kind of like the main
I think there
residence
was a
area.
TV show.
Yes, there was a TV show, I believe, about the West Wing, I think the name of the building was alluded to in the title, but the East Wing is right over there by where the Treasury building is, and so if you're walking on the closest public streets, you can kind of see it behind the Treasury building. But there was still something very, very jarring about just the visuals of like a demolition site at the White House. And then, so there's that. And then, even beyond that, it's not like Trump went through any of the appropriate
Right.
processes to get permitting for any of this, which is very king-like behavior. And then, of course, the price tag has gone up to 300 million from 200 million basically overnight. And there's a list of donors that the White House released that companies like Apple and I believe Meta was on there as well, that have given money, but it didn't say how much money was given. And Trump has pledged to give some of his own funds for it, but he hasn't said how much. And all of this lack of transparency, sort of the lack of oversight and just kind of making decisions without any appropriate input from like the planning commission or anybody who might oversee a major construction project like this that the federal government is doing. It's all very king-like, and that's just one of many aspects in which we could get into this week where Trump responded to a protest that was about opposing King by basically reinforcing that that's how he sees himself.
Yeah, he has some version of oppositional defiance disorder. We've known this for a long time. I'm happy to do an armchair diagnosis of that. I mean,
Yeah.
anytime Trump gets told to do something or not do something, he wants to do the exact opposite. And so that's why, exactly why he's doing this sort of thing. By the way, folks, we always take your questions in this chat. There's so many comments, though, of people having awesome experiences at No Kings
Yeah.
that we're falling a little bit behind. But Catherine says, I can't build a fence in my HOA without
Yeah.
shit. And it's like,
Right.
yeah, exactly. And, I was reading a depressing article about this. I think it was in the Washington Post just yesterday, that there's basically very little, basically almost nothing that can be done. Like, so much of what typically tends to happen with things like renovating the White House involves people being good stewards, having good character, talking to all stakeholders,
Mhm.
and being very cautious before making any changes. But again, as we've seen with so much in Trump, those are just norms, traditions, expectations, and he doesn't give a damn about any of that stuff. And
Mhm.
so, in this case, it turns out that there just aren't many guardrails around being able to destroy the East Wing of the White House, which, by the way, has been around for the better part of a century.
Mhm.
And yet, even if there were, Trump understands you send in the bulldozers, then it can't be undone. Even if there were
Yeah.
strong rules about this, what are you going to do against the bulldozer?
Yeah, and I don't know if you saw, I believe it was Josh Marshall who connected the dots on this with, another aspect of Trump's king-like behavior this week is his push to basically pilfer $230 million over
Yeah,
a settlement, that he alleges, that these prosecutions of him pertaining to January 6th were, like somehow wronged him in a way where there were damages. And he's recouping these funds by basically just pilfering money from the Treasury. But Josh Marshall put it out there that when you kind of connect the dots on this, they say that this ballroom is going to be $300. Trump even mentioned
wait,
350 million.
300. You said $300.
Oh,
You said
$300 million
$300 million.
dollars. Pardon me, $300 million dollars. The numerical illiteracy of most Americans is something that Trump capitalizes on all the time. So I don't want to, kind of reinforce that at $300 million. Of course, the example that's front of mind for me with that is how he claims that, I think his latest estimate is that he secured over $20 trillion of investment in the
Right.
United States, and the entire US GDP is 30 trillion. So
Trillion.
there's
Yep.
absolutely no way that is correct. But, the way that he just uses numbers in such a willy-nilly way that it can be kind of bewildering. But no, it's 300 million is what he claimed for the ballroom. Then yesterday he mentioned 350 million. But to get back to the point I was making originally, when you kind of connect the dots with the 230 million that he wants to take, from the DOJ, basically from taxpayers, obviously, and how much the ballroom costs, it kind of seems like maybe he's trying to pilfer that money just to put it toward this ballroom that he wants. And, maybe with the donors that have been cited by the White House as contributing, making up the difference there. So, I don't think that's been confirmed, but that does kind of make a little bit of sense because, all of a sudden this week he was talking about this $230 million figure, which is like oddly specific. And then when
Right.
you kind of have the backdrop of the billions that his family has made with, the crypto ventures and a lot of the corruption that we've seen taken to a new level over the past 9 months, 200, it sounds weird to say, but for Trump, $230 million at this point kind of seems like small potatoes for him. Given what we know about how much his family has cashed in this year, but then if it's to go toward this other project that he really wants with the White House, then it starts to maybe make a little bit more sense that's what the money is for. So just kind of putting that out there, I thought that was interesting. That hasn't been confirmed, but it certainly makes some sense.
Yeah, I would believe it, but also Trump is such a money grubber,
Yeah.
stiffing contractors for a few $1,000 here and there just because he can. So he probably thinks he's going to profit off of all that in the end, right? I mean, if donors are supposedly funding this new ballroom, and Eric asked in comments, maybe a little bit rhetorically, should the next Democratic president tear down that ballroom? I mean, hell yes.
Yeah.
And there's one train of thought that's really bothered me about this, which is some pundits and even some Democratic politicians saying, well, I don't think your average voter actually cares about this. Even Gretchen Whitmer, governor of
Hmm.
Michigan, was saying this. And it's like, well, first off, not every issue has to resonate with every voter. Second off, my God, those visuals are astounding.
Yeah.
And, people see those and don't presume to speak on behalf of, every single everyday American. A lot
Mhm.
of people probably are very upset about this. I haven't really dug into any of the polling on this. I'll be curious to see more of it. But it's things like those visuals that take abstract things and make them really concrete. Like, it can be a challenge to message about things for Democrats, things like healthcare premiums are about to skyrocket. But when you see the White House in rubble,
Yeah.
that's a vivid image. And again, it doesn't have to resonate with everyone. What matters is that it resonates with some people. And I am sure that after seeing those images, there are some people who are sitting back and saying, "Wow, holy crap!"
Yeah, and it's part of the job of politicians is to get people to care about things too, and certainly
Yes,
when you can connect something like this with the broader narrative of the king-like behavior, of the lack of oversight, of the flouting of, any sort of interacting with other agencies or making the process collaborative. There's probably a way that Trump could have done this, that would have been, I mean, it still would have been tacky to have this gigantic ballroom, which for people who have seen the mock-ups, and I've seen a little bit of controversy over this because actually our newsletter today in Public Notice is focused largely on this and kind of this idea that Trump used tax dollars, the Treasury, as basically being like his personal piggy bank, and the White House renovation of sorts being one component of this. But there was actually an architect in the comments who said that he's dubious that there even really is like a specific plan because some of the
yeah,
renderings don't match. Like the inside rendering doesn't really match the outside rendering, and they're not really in a form that an actual architectural document would take. And that would not surprise me if that's the case. But again, like this idea of kind of dismissing it that it's not something that people care about. I mean, I would say that I posted a few snippets this week because actually Reuters had a live feed of the demolition work that were super viral, where people definitely, felt it. And many of the comments were like, this sickens me, like, I can't believe this is happening sort of thing. And then yesterday I saw that the Secret Service cleared Reuters and other reporters who were covering the demolition from the Ellipse Park where they were getting their images from, obviously aware of the fact that these are politically damaging and that they're spreading and that people are having a negative reaction. So I think that right there, kind of shows how sensitive this is for the White House. So, probably the worst of it is behind them. Not the demolition work has been completed, although some of the renderings indicate that this ballroom is going to be like much larger than the actual White House residence. And so it's really going to change kind of the visual appearance of that area in a way that I think people will largely find to be pretty tacky. Is that going to be, a huge issue in 2028 or something like that? I mean, I kind of doubt it, but, these things kind of add up. And again, there's a broader narrative here. And, someone like Whitmer, I think some Democrats have been really good about this kind of connecting the dots and, because all the corruption, the self-dealing, I mean, it's all related to each other. And so, that's part of being a skillful politician is kind of connecting those dots, telling that story and getting people to care.
I'm so glad that you circled back to that because I really want to hammer that home. Getting people to care is so important. And when someone like Gretchen Whitmer says, I don't think people care about the White House being demolished, what she's really saying is, I don't really care. And that's sad and disappointing. And, to me, the perfect example, such an excellent example of successfully getting people to care in the right way about the right thing was Chris Van Hollen, the Maryland senator, who went to the ends of the earth to secure justice for Kilmar Abrego Garcia. And, he, went down there, visited the prison. And this was at a time when, a lot of pundits and Democrats were like, don't raise the salience of immigration. That's where Trump is strongest. And that turned out to be the exact wrong advice because by elevating this issue, it put a human face on the terror that Trump is wreaking with his immigration assault. And Trump's numbers immediately began to tank on immigration. And then once Abrego Garcia faded from the news, they rose back up. And then once ICE and the ICE raids started coming back in and the deploying the military to Los Angeles, his numbers started to go back down again. So yeah, if you want people to care, make them care if you think they should care. And it's not that hard. Like I said, it's so vivid. And I'm reading the comments there and just breaking my heart about, one commenter said that they cried on and off for 2 days. I totally get it. Like I see these images and like I said earlier, I really don't have the words to express this as many horrible things as Trump has done. This one just really hits me in my heart.
Yeah.
And there's so many other issues that Democrats can raise. And like I said, it also depends on your audience, and if one issue, if you don't succeed with raising the salience of one issue, then go to the next one. It's not like Trump doesn't offer a million targets of opportunity. He certainly does.
Yeah, and I will say, when the list of the donors was released for, the companies that are contributing, and there's some individuals named as well, Apple being on that list kind of hit me because, I'm an iPhone user and I have a MacBook. And, there's been a few occasions like this because obviously Apple has kind of coded up to Trump, but, knowing that they were kind of bankrolling the demolition of part of the White House, and then the replacement of it with a tacky ballroom, that was one of those moments where like, is Android really that bad? Maybe I should try the Samsung Galaxy again or something. We'll see. I don't know if I'm going to quite commit to that level, but it was one of those moments. And I even saw in the videos of the demolition, people calling out the companies for some of the demolition equipment where, like some of the cranes, it wasn't even really cranes, more like, just kind of machines that were destroying the structure, were emblazoned by logos of various companies. And I saw people even kind of tagging them on social media that, this is a bad look for them to be associated. I don't know if I necessarily blame those companies because I don't think they necessarily knew what their equipment was being used for. But, it was one of those moments where, it seems like people really are kind of hungry for accountability or to try to respond in some way, that's constructive or at least having their dollars speak on their behalf. And so, I thought that was both it hit me kind of personally in that way, but I saw a lot of people having a similar reaction of just, being disgusted and wanting to do what they can to make, these companies and individuals that played a role in this pay a price for it.
Yeah. And, when we were discussing this episode and talking about, Trump proving the No Kings movement right, we knew he was going to in every respect because that's why the No Kings movement exists in the first place. And it's not just at home, but also abroad because we are seeing this stepped up military activity now in the Caribbean, the murder of what are allegedly drug boats and are very possibly just fishing boats. The crews on these boats, the fact that they repatriated two survivors of one of these murderous attacks. I mean, if they were criminals, why aren't they being prosecuted, right? And now I don't know if you saw, Aaron, just before we went on, there was a report in Fox News that Trump is directing a carrier group to the
I just
Caribbean.
yep.
Yeah. And this guy, I mean, he has no problem whining every day about how he didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize, and yet he wants to start a war to overthrow a leader in South America, and not a good guy by any stretch. But like this isn't what we do.
Yeah, and all of that being said, I mean, I think the clip that maybe disturbed me the most this week. That did get a fair bit of pickup, but it was one of these moments where Trump was mid monologue, and kind of the interesting thing that he said was buried in like a 5-minute rant, but where he was bringing up some of the 2020 big lie, that it was stolen from him, this and that, and he said something to the effect of like, we can never let this happen
Yes,
again in our
yes,
country, and Cash is working on it, and Tulsi is working on it, because we can never let this happen again, which is a Democrat winning a presidential election. I mean, that's literally what he was talking about. And so then the specific name dropping of both Cash and Tulsi obviously raises a lot of questions too, because it's like, so what would Tulsi Gabbard's role in this be? And then the backdrop of yesterday, Hegseth, I'm not sure if you saw the clip where he was asked specifically about this reported document that would it's like a directive that would create basically a National Guard response force that could be deployed in any state, with just a few hours notice by next spring, said to have this kind of ready to go by April of 2026. And he basically confirmed that it's a legit document. And so then you start to wonder, well, what's that going to be used for? And, of course, we've had J.D. Pritzker in Illinois specifically bringing up with regard to Trump's desire to deploy troops there, that he thinks it's for basically election meddling to kind of normalize this idea of troops ahead of the midterms next year. So yeah, it certainly doesn't seem like Trump moderated any of his behavior. Not that we would expect that from him, coming out of the No Kings. There's no sort of sense that he took that in any sort of way, in a way of being like a legitimate response to his actions. Again, he
of
dismissed
course
them as
not.
being small rallies. And, I think he called them yesterday. He had a comment about how most of the protesters were lowlives, was the
Right.
term that he used. And so, this isn't surprising, but, I guess the thing that we can take from those protests is kind of the camaraderie with other like-minded people, in the sense that we're not alone, and that there is kind of a mobilized opposition to Trump. But if you maybe thought he would lay low for a week or kind of chill out, I mean, certainly has not been the case this week. Again, that's one of the things that's kind of every week there's new reminders of this, but like, he's just never content with there being kind of a lull in the news cycle. Like
Yeah.
he's such a hog of attention all of the time. And like you're mentioning, yeah, I mean, I was getting ready to hop on with you, and I saw that Fox report as they were kind of talking about it on the air, and it's like, what is the urgency for this? Like, why is this happening right now? I mean, it just, I'm sure there's some kind of plan that he has for why these things need to happen when they do, but just every day, it's something new. And the fact that it was just a few days ago where he was talking about taking $230 million from the Treasury to settle these bogus gripes that he has about the prosecutions of him. I mean, that already kind of feels like old news, where
Huh.
he had a press conference yesterday where, he was taking questions for like an hour. And a friend of mine, Justin, actually from the Tennessee Hauler, I'm sure he wouldn't mind that I brought this up, but he texted me and was like, did anybody ask him about the 230 million? And I was like, no, they didn't, actually. Cause like most of the questions
Wow.
were about the White House demolition/renovation. And he was kind of like, don't you think that's weird that, this is like a really huge story of corruption and no one's asking him? And I'm like, yeah, but I honestly, until you asked me, it didn't even occur to me, because there's like so much going on, that
Yeah.
it's just constant. And, I think that's kind of part of the secret sauce for him too, is, people are just off balance constantly, because before we even get our minds around one scandal, there's a new one. And of course we lived this during his first term, but it almost feels like more intense now, especially with kind of the saber rattling and with Venezuela and, concerns about where that's going. I'm still pretty skeptical that he's going to lead us into any sort of hot war with Venezuela. Although if you kind of take him at face value with what he's saying, now he's saying that there needs to be strikes on land to deter drugs from coming into the country, which seems to be about Venezuela, because I don't know what other land he would be referring to there. But that seems really politically perilous, where I don't think they've really effectively made any sort of public case as to why that's necessary. I just don't really sense any sort of popular support for that. Combined with, I mean, that was a real part of his appeal during the campaign, was the sense that he was not interventionist, and that, the whole thing
Right.
with Biden in Ukraine, that Biden somehow got us involved in Ukraine, even though obviously there are no U.S. troops there, but that, we were kind of overstretched abroad and, at risk of kind of stumbling into some sort of world war. I always knew that that was BS, but I do think a lot of people who voted for Trump thought that it wasn't. And so to me, it just seems a lot of downside and not much upside for him. But I think maybe there's upside in this kind of the saber rattling and the projection of strength and, the idea that he's kind of bullying people and, coming across in that way, sort of a strongman leader.
It's funny that you mentioned Justin because he actually was the guest on my other podcast, the Down Ballot podcast,
I saw
talking about
that.
the
Yeah.
upcoming special election on December 2 in Tennessee 7th District, which is a district, the prior version that Justin actually ran for. So
Oh,
he was
okay.
perfect guest to discuss that. But what you're talking about, this constant Trump fire hose, is very much part of the autocrats' playbook. And Stalin was relentless in just exhausting everyone around him. And did you ever read the book by Arthur Kessler, Darkness at Noon?
I haven't read that. No.
It's one of these books that really stuck with me, and it's a story about a political prisoner in the Soviet Union.
Hmm.
And one passage in particular that I think about is one of the interrogators tells his prisoner, he explains to his prisoner that when the revolution started and they were, I may not be capturing this exactly right, and they were, arresting people and rounding them up. People weren't breaking. And then it so happened that one time they went and arrested someone in the middle of the night. And at 2 a.m, all of a sudden, people were much more tired. They were exhausted and they were scared. And that's when they started to break.
Hmm.
And I feel like Trump's approach is very much that writ large, that he is just trying to exhaust people. And the fact that he wants $230 million in a total bribe of taxpayer money for himself just because he's aggrieved, that a day later, that's not even a topic of the press corps.
Yeah.
It's exhausting to keep up. I mean, you know this better than anyone, literally better
Mhm.
than anyone.
No, I'm with you, and that's why I couldn't really generate much indignation in that case because my thought was kind of like, well, the White House being demolished is kind of a big story too, So I don't know, but and some of the questions that he was getting yesterday were a little bit better than normal. I mean, of course, the press corps now is stuffed with these kind of right
Right.
wing propagandists, like Caitlin Collins had a pretty good question about the White House demolition, and there's still some real reporters that kind of sneak in there and are able to ask him questions. How you have to put up with being berated because I think he called Collins like a talentless hack or something yesterday while he was responding to her. And I'm sure, people in her position, that's kind of part of the job description at this point if you're going to be a White House correspondent. But yeah, it's just kind of a flurry. And, I saw someone commented recently here, Catherine did, that Stalin did not have social media. I don't know if that makes it more, I mean, in some ways I think it makes it more effective, but, of course, in some ways, it's easier to control the press when there's fewer outlets. When it was kind of like Pravda or whatever the
Right.
radio and the newspaper at the time, you can kind of control the message more tightly than you can on social media. But obviously, Trump has been very effective in kind of using social media for his ends as well. Including I woke up this morning and Trump was having like a multi Truth Social post meltdown about tariffs and how, but again, some of his things are so outrageous that normally it would be kind of a big scandal. Some of the stuff that he says, but it's not even. It's so normalized. I mean, he claimed that the tariffs case is the most important case in the history of the Supreme Court this morning, and like,
Oh,
did
yes.
that? Yeah, and did anybody even really bother to kind of debunk that or challenge him? I didn't really. I read it. I just sort of. I did end up posting on social media that he was having a meltdown about tariffs, but I think just the sheer absurdity and the egregiousness of the corruption, he's successfully normalized a lot of this stuff by kind of wearing people out. I mean, to your point of exhausting people, I think it just gets to be a lot to handle every day. And of course, that's it's part of what you do for work, it's part of what I do for work. But if you're just a normie who consumes news because you want to be a well-informed person, I mean, I can certainly understand being it's kind of at a certain point feeling compelled to sort of, if not to tune it out, to at least turn it down a little bit.
What amazes me is that he doesn't get exhausted, especially
Yeah.
because he's an old man, extremely unfit, unhealthy. And I may have said this before on this show. I almost feel like his superpower is his ability to never stop raging and to
Hmm.
never stop being aggrieved and to never stop sharing those grievances. It really is something to behold.
Hmm.
I just feel like it lights a constant fire under his true believers and his supporters and Republicans in Congress that he just never shuts up about what he's complaining about. He will never be satisfied. There will never be a day where he says, "No, I'm pretty chill. I'm pretty happy today."
Yeah, it's a weird thing too, because like yesterday, for instance, he was on camera for like 4 to 5 hours. He had two separate events,
It's
including like taking questions for at least like 45 minutes. And if you actually watch these events, like I do, obviously, I mean, they're appalling in terms of he's incoherent, he's ranting and raving, he's insulting people. He's been doing this thing lately where when attractive women reporters ask him questions, he'll be like, "Oh, you got such beautiful red hair," or like, "Who are you with?" Or, "Boy, I like taking questions from you." Or you even had one remark last week about, "I just like to," he ignored the question, was like, "I just like to watch you talk," or something like that.
oh yeah,
Which I posted a clip of that too. But it's like, so this is part of the problem though, is that to really get a sense of his unfitness, I feel like you kind of have to watch these things.
yeah,
And then when you watch, the TV news or you listen to, public radio, how they cover these things, almost by definition, they have to sort of sanitize this stuff because they take the sound bites that have some sort of meaning towards like policy or where he's announcing something. But, the parts where he's totally incoherent and ranting and raving, or, he can't hear the questions, and he clearly has some difficulty with his hearing these days. Like that stuff doesn't really break through, unless you're kind of paying attention to people like me on social media or you're just like a news junkie. And yet for him, for his support to kind of really collapse, like more people just need to be tuned in. This was a challenge during the campaign last year too, where, especially toward the end when he was doing, like you're saying, I mean, his ability to never stop raging, that is true, but he does get tired, and he was doing like 3 to 4 rallies a day. And by the end of these rallies, I mean, he was just looking exhausted and totally incoherent and hoarse. And, but it just like never really got through to people, that this is who he is. And, so it's I don't think there's really any sort of silver bullet solution to that. People aren't going to spend all day watching Trump like I do. I do it obviously for work. But if you end up just kind of not paying any attention and you just see what you might read in the newspaper or hear on the radio or see like on the TV news, I mean, you might think that he's like a mostly normal president. Unless you're living in Portland or Chicago or a place where you're kind of feeling the effects on the ground. So that is the challenge. I mean, even today, I hate to be kind of put in this position, but the new inflation report came out this morning, and like there's a part of me that kind of wants inflation to go up because people need to feel some pain, over these policies that Trump has been implementing. Now, I think the numbers today were government numbers, where I believe I read that they brought some workers back from furlough to put this report together,
hmm
and the report came back, pretty much in line where inflation's a little higher than what you would like it to be. It's about 3%, but it's not spiking. Um, but you're kind of put in this position where it's like you're almost rooting for bad news so that people feel a little bit of pain and maybe make different voting choices the next time around. And but then there's the next thought of like, well, we know that Trump fired the BLS director over a bad jobs report in the summer. Can we trust these inflation numbers? You really can't when you think about it. Now someone would presumably leak from the inside if they were really being manipulated. But there's just so many layers, to the thorough corruption of the government that, you're kind of left in a spot where you're sort of rooting for bad news. And sometimes people aren't like horribly affected by it. But then even when the news isn't that, it's like, well, can we really believe that things are like this? Or, is the whole institution so corrupt at this point that they're scared to put out the true numbers because then Trump might fire them because he's already done that. So anyway, we're a long way from no kings, but these are some things on my mind here on this Friday afternoon.
this is how it goes. Well, Aaron, we've been talking a lot about bad news, as you just mentioned, and I wanted to change gears rather abruptly to mention some good news, which is in just under 2 weeks, a week and a half from now, we'll have the November 4 elections in a whole variety of states, and there are a number of important races on the ballot, including in Virginia. And a fascinating story that's completely unexpected just broke this week, and I'm still amazed. Virginia Democrats are reportedly planning to try to redraw their congressional map to counter the GOP gerrymanders that Trump has kicked off, starting with Texas, but also North Carolina, Missouri, and likely other states. And it's totally unexpected because, like a lot of other blue or swing states, Virginia has a redistricting commission that's in the state constitution. And to change that, you have to amend the constitution. That's exactly what California is doing. The process is a lot easier in California, though. In California, the legislature simply has to take a single vote and they can refer an amendment to voters right away. And that's the vote that's happening on November 4, Proposition 50, that would put in place a map that's much more favorable to Democrats to help counter what's going on in Texas and elsewhere. In Virginia, the process for amending the Constitution is a lot more difficult because you have to have two votes by the legislature before the voters can actually vote on a new amendment. And it seemed like there was just no way that there was going to be enough time to do that before 2026. Well, this is the amazing part of it, that according to all reports, Democrats are planning to meet. They definitely are meeting on Monday. They're convening a special session of the legislature on Monday, and they're reportedly planning to pass an amendment that would allow for a new map to be put in place. And then they're going to pass. Then the idea is that when they reconvene in January, they'll pass the amendment the second time. And the key thing here is, Aaron, that when the amendment has to be passed twice by the legislature, but it has to be both before an election and after an election. And I think the thinking behind that is, if the legislature passes an amendment and it's really unpopular, then voters get the chance to weigh in and, change the composition of the legislature before they get a second bite at the apple. And so, Democrats are taking something of a risk. All 100 seats in the House of Delegates are up on November 4. Democrats have just a 51-49 majority. They look poised to make gains. Republicans are doing very poorly on the fundraising front. Things don't look good for them, but they're taking a risk. And then, if they're able to pull this off, then there would probably be a vote sometime in April or so, where voters would hopefully then agree to this amendment and be able to put in place a new map. And this was a very buoying story for me to read, because I did not expect Virginia. I don't think anyone expected Virginia to be on the list of states where Democrats might actually be able to fight back. And boom, all of a sudden, there it is. And I should add that Democrats could potentially target 2 or even 3 Republican-held seats with a new map, which would help wipe out what Republicans have done in North Carolina and Missouri. Look, don't get me wrong, this all sucks. We should have nonpartisan redistricting everywhere. But, if the fascists are going to try to rig the elections, you have to fight back.
Yeah, and there's a question from Martha that maybe, David, you can answer this. She writes, "Did Spanberger speak out against redistricting? Has she commented on?"
I don't think she's addressed this. She probably doesn't want to address this.
Yes.
She can probably run out the clock in the next week and a half. I imagine it might get a little harder after, assuming Democrats take a vote sometime next week, it'll come up. And, she'll probably deflect. But also, here's the thing, it doesn't matter because the governor doesn't play a role in amending the state constitution. Only the legislature just has to pass an amendment twice, then the voters get to vote. The only role that Spanberger might play would be if they need to delay the primary to accommodate a new map. Then you would want her to be her in place as governor so that she could sign a bill. Right now, though, all the polls and all the spending, basically every piece of evidence there is, indicates that she is going to win.
Yeah, I know that you've been tracking you have a state-by-state thing on the down ballot, kind of tracking all of the redistricting efforts. What is kind of the net right now? I mean, obviously, it sounds like you might have to adjust it with Virginia if this happens.
Yep.
My sense is still that Republicans are going to kind of the zero-sum aspect of this, that they're going to win because, there's so many seats in Texas. Even in California, there's only so much juice you can get from the squeeze of redistricting there. What's your sense on that? Like, if you kind of get it all nationally, how does that shake out?
It's really, really hard to say because there's just so many moving pieces. And also, I have to stress that just because one side targets a seat in redistricting, it's not necessarily a guarantee. I mean, in some cases, yes, it's a guarantee. When they take, a Harris plus 20 seat and turn it into a Trump plus 20 seat, the odds of Democrats hanging on to that are exceedingly low, maybe zero. But in other cases, some of these gerrymanders are much less aggressive. So it's a little difficult to say. So, for instance, Texas Republicans, they're going after 5 seats, but, if in a good Democratic year, it's possible that maybe they only flip 2 of those. The California gerrymander is actually stronger than the Texas one. I would be surprised if California Democrats net fewer than 4 seats. I think they have a good chance of getting all 5. Then you have North Carolina. They're going after one Democratic seat. Democrats have said that they plan to keep fighting, even though it's now a Trump plus 12 seat. So we'll see. In Missouri, this is a really good example. They passed a map targeting one Democratic seat. But right now, Democrats are trying to qualify what's called a veto referendum for the ballot. And what that means is anytime the state of Missouri passes a law, voters can put a ballot initiative on the ballot that allows voters to weigh in whether they want to keep that law or repeal it. And the very act of qualifying the ballot measure pauses the law in question until the vote can be held. So it's possible that, if Democrats succeed in qualifying this ballot measure, that the map simply won't take effect for 2026, no matter what happens with the repeal referendum. So, I could go on for days about this. Maybe one day we'll do an episode
Yeah.
devoted to we'll run down every single state if people promise they won't cry from boredom. It's very difficult to forecast the net. The fact is, though, Republicans have more targets. And
Mhm.
I think that it's very likely that Republicans wind up with a handful to maybe as many as 10 seats net out of this, depending on how aggressive they are and how many states follow through. But even if they get their maximalist gains, that doesn't mean Democrats can't win back the House. It's garbage. It
Right.
sucks. It shouldn't be the playing field. But do not write off the House, no matter what happens with redistricting.
Yeah, because it's worth keeping in mind that I believe it was 2018. Dems picked up something like 40 seats, right, relative to
40
the.
exactly on the nose.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, that kind of gives you a sense of the numbers. Where even if Republicans can gerrymander their way to 10 safer districts, that's not going to be enough if the national environment is generic ballot D+5 or something like that.
Yeah.
That won't be enough. And I did have some specific Virginia questions I wanted to ask you, but let's put a pin in that because I think next week, we'll have another episode before
Yes.
the elections occur. And so we can devote next Friday to really kind of drilling down Virginia, New Jersey are the two big ones. Maybe we'll even get into the NYC mayoral and any other races, David, because I'm sure there are many.
There are.
Yes. So we can get in, the ones that are top mind for me because they get the most coverage, nationally are obviously Virginia, New Jersey, but it might also be interesting to kind of drill down and talk about some ones that are a layer deeper than that.
I would love that. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you for sharing your stories about No Kings. I'm sorry that we struggled a bit to get to questions today, but I was super glad to see the enthusiasm and comments and the amazing stories. 1,300 folks tuned in. Another awesome episode. And we will be back next week, 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central. If you're in another time zone, you're going to have to math that out yourself. Have a great weekend, everybody.
See ya.
Bye-bye.